are very blessed because we're on the other side. They were looking for the Messiah to come, looking for the kingdom to come. And now we are looking at this backwards because the kingdom has already come. Jesus came. And just like those Israelites, we have this, which is our guide to help us cross over into the kingdom, right? And just like the Israelites, there are giants in the land. How many of us know that there's giants that we fight in this land? And there's evil. But we're not going to, he's not going to zap us out of here, or he's going to equip us for the battle, but it's our battle to fight, right? We do it with his weapons of war, and a lot of that is in the spiritual realm, and we're going to see it was no different back then. A lot of that was in the spiritual. So what we have to do is we have to apply this. You have to take your filters off of this saying, this is just Old Testament, it doesn't apply. No, it's all God's Word. It definitely applies. We just need to be understanding of how to apply it with the context and understanding that we're not going to apply it legalistically, but the principles still remain, right? Anything else in there about this, Chris?
No, I mean, I think it's a short chapter. We thought we were going to have some extra time this morning, but we ended up going pretty deep. And
yeah, this morning we had quite a conversation.
Yeah, we barely finished the short chapter.
It's amazing how relevant this information is.
Yeah.
When you would think we would study second giving of the law that happened,
right,
how many thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
And here it's so relevant in our very day. And especially this chapter seemed to hit directly at where we are as America today. And just as a baseline here, when you see the term Israelite, you need to think you, because we are the modern Israelites, right? We were adopted in, we're a branch, we're children of Abraham, so don't let people steal your blessing, right? So we are, the blessings here apply to you, and the curses apply to you, right? You can't have one and not the other, right? So if you're doing something that's wrong, then it's going to say in here that there's consequences for that. God disciplines his children, right? And the better we understand those consequences and the blessings, then the more we can live in that abundant life. Because those spiritual laws are even more real than our laws of nature, as we would call it, like gravity, right? We all aren't going to argue gravity, but for some reason we tend to argue spiritual laws, like, oh, well, those don't apply to me. Just because they're delayed sometimes in the fulfillment of it, they very much apply. Go ahead.
That's the equilibrium, right?
Right. Yeah, it's the equilibrium. You got to keep things in balance, right? Anything else?
And the other thing to remember is who was the perfect Israelite.
Exactly.
Perfect anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that being said, let's go ahead and read the first 3 verses. Who'd like to read?
At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of the release. Every creditor that has granted anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Of a foreigner, you may require it, or you shall give up the claim to what is owed by the brother.
So, do you think this applies to our culture today?
It should, but it doesn't.
Right. I mean, we have a whole system based on debt. Our whole economy is based on consumerism, right? I mean, the whole economy, they measure consumer spending. Like, if you don't go out there and participate in buying all these excesses and participate in debt, then our economy is going to suffer, right? It's a whole debt-based economy. Do our credit card companies have a 7-year provision where they cancel your debt? You know, we have one of the largest consumer credit card levels right now than we've ever had. People are swimming in debt. And the minimum payments on those credit cards actually cause what we call negative amortization. So if you pay the minimum is less than the interest that is accumulating. So you can actually pay the minimum and the debt will continue to rise. So it's slavery It is absolute slavery. And God tells us
That we
not to
enter into
participate.
willingly. Yeah.
Yes, we shouldn't be participating in this. And we're going to go through some of the rules of how God set it up. So when you understand these rules, then you'll understand how far we've gotten away from that. And by the way, Israel didn't do much better than we did. We've just taken it to a whole new level at this point. But these are the gold standard, and we have gotten so far away from it.
But the debt was supposed to be repaid by somebody who wasn't part of Israel.
Well,
It was
we're
only
going to
the
get to that.
brothers, Only
Yeah,
the
this is
brothers.
a community standard, yeah.
This is a community standard, so basically, and we could go back to that, but if we were a locally based economy, which is what we should be doing, if you remember the old, what's the Christmas with Jimmy
It's a
Stewart?
wonderful life.
Yeah, It's a Wonderful Life, where he's the bank examiner, right? And the people come in for their bank money, and they go, well, I need to get my money out. He says, well, your money went to build Billy's house, and your money went to build, Tracy's, outbuilding and barn, and, all this. That's how banking was supposed to be done. That's the community thing, right? I happen to be in banking now, and that's not where it's going, right? It's going all over the place. So our little community banks that were supposed to be for our little area, and that's what he's saying here is this context is within your community. It's like, I'm going to lend to Billy, but in 7 years, it'll be forgiven, right? And because I don't want him to be permanently in debt. It doesn't help us. It doesn't
Right.
help the community. It doesn't help anybody for someone to be permanently slaved in debt. A temporary loan to get somebody through is charitable. And at some point, it's charity, if you can't pay it back, right? So that's what it's supposed to be. Okay, it's not about not lending. It's about lending responsibly and not in a debt slave mentality.
Also, if a Christian lends money to another Christian, after 7 years, they figured out how to do without it anyway.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And you're going exactly where we want to apply it, right? So this is that other part. We study it, we understand the context of it, and how do we apply it. So obviously, who's our community now, right? And who's our brother, and those type of things, right? Okay.
So I mean, it's in our day, I think it's a couple of things. We have to delay gratification, right? There's half the stuff we charge we could do without. But for those things you can't do without, you should be going to Calvary Baptist and not to Chase and Citibank, right? We should be helping each other.
Right. We should be an acts like
But
church.
you gotta have that foundation in which this church doesn't have and almost every church doesn't have.
Okay.
Yeah, act, and that's not really socialism. It's community.
It's voluntary.
Yeah, it's not anyone telling you have to do it. It's voluntary, but you got this funds or goods set aside for when people need them.
There is one sect in the United States that does practice this, and it's the Amish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And it doesn't matter if the child's going to be on life support the rest of your life.
Yeah.
It's taken care of by the church. But it's a set-up thing from birth. You're putting into
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Your family may never use it, but the concept is great.
Yeah.
And they practice it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like they're barn raising. They like the whole community comes and they get the barn up in like one day.
One day, yes.
They do this very well. They also do other things very well, like their food supply, and they don't have all the medical and the illnesses we have. And,
They do have medical illnesses, but not all of them. They do get cancer, but not at the rate that we get cancer.
No.
Their types of cancer are very different than ours.
And their autism rate is like 0.
Mhm.
So, okay, 4 through 5.
He said, when there may be no poor among you, the Lord will greatly bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance. Only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe care all these commandments which I command you today.
So, we live in a culture that wants us to get in cities and wants us to be in little small apartments, and they want to get us away from the land. So if you go back to Deuteronomy and you see a lot of these verses, the blessings, see, the blessings are tied to the land, right? So we see a lot of this. So spiritually speaking, you got to wonder about that, right? Why the draw to the cities versus the land, right? If the blessings are in the land, like the further we get away from the land and the nature, and the further we get away from our peace and all that. I mean, I remember personally, just when I moved from McKinney to Bonham, and here where we've got a little bit of land and definitely a view of the water and all that, the peace. I mean, I literally had to detox, I think, for probably 2 months from the noise. I just didn't realize all the noise I had in McKinney. It was like, it was amazing how much noise that I had gotten accustomed to. I couldn't even sleep at night for a while. I had to play, like sound stuff so I could actually sleep, and to get myself detoxed, from all of that. And now it's like when I go there for banking jobs, or, I'm in Dallas all the time, it's like, it's almost overwhelming with everything, to your senses. And I just don't think we were made to do that. We're electrical creatures. We got to be grounded, right? I don't know if y'all studied into that, but our nervous system is all electrical based. And when you're touching the earth with barefoot or with, grounding shoes or something like that, it's healthy for your body and all this. And we're in all these concrete, cities where there is no ground, and there's, it's and we wonder why we have poor health outcomes, and why, all of it, I think, is kind of tied together. I think I went a little off base here, but the poor here in verse 4, we're going to contrast that with verse 11. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, or we want to wait till we get to 11.
Yeah, I mean, you can just see this. If basically, the way I look at it is, if God's people followed God's will, there would be no poor, because we'd all be taking care of each other. Or the poor would be like situational, and something bad happened, fire, whatever, and then God's people helped each other and got whoever it was back on their feet. But socialism might be a great concept, except for human sin, right? As soon as as soon as the person who's given everything to the commune says, "Oh, I deserve a little bit more," then it falls apart ultimately. So that's why it doesn't work, is because of human sin and human greed, and that's why ultimately that's a contributing factor to why they're poor. People don't make the best decisions, whether it's on either end.
Well, and it's coerced
Yeah.
in socialism.
Yeah.
Well, even when it's not necessarily coerced, I mean, if you read back to the founding of America, like the Mayflower Compact and all that, there's letters and historical documents, because they started that way. They started as a total socialism, and they were facing starvation and everything else, because what they had was, what we all know, was they had 40% of the people were doing 100% of the work. And then they were sharing it, but the other 60% were just relying on their neighbors instead of actually working themselves. And then after a couple of seasons of that, and them facing almost starvation and death, there's actually letters how they wrote that they said they can't do this anymore. And then they had private property, and then they said, okay, you get to keep the yields, any extra you can sell. And once they flipped to that, they had such an abundance that they actually invited the Indians, and then that was the first Thanksgiving, right? So, the concepts are there, right? And even what did Jesus say, provide the man a fish, or you can teach him to fish, right? And so the concepts are there. And what I see in here is, this is kind of like what we talked about this morning, is kind of like sin. When Jesus told them to go and sin no more, what did he mean by that? Did he mean that they were never, ever going to sin again? He meant the heart was that they were not to sin, right? Their heart so the heart here is that the poor, it's not that there's not going to be poor, it's that there's not going to be this chronic poor, right? There's going to be situational poverty and that type of stuff, but if you actually did like Chris said, and we all did our will, then we wouldn't have any chronic poverty. We would only have situational poverty, right? Because the resources are here. God gave us abundant resources. It's the allocation of those resources that are off, and it's the wickedness of the heart of men, right? So the solution isn't to depopulate, right? I mean, we know that from Genesis, right? What was God? It was populate, and fill the earth, right? So we know that's not. So when people start saying overpopulation, you should immediately, your filter should go, that's satanic, right? Because that's against the will of God. We know it immediately. As soon as somebody says, oh, the problem is overpopulation, it can't be. That means God was a liar, right? So.
I don't know that Jesus said teach a man to fish, but
No.
it's a good metaphor.
Right, a metaphor. Yeah, maybe not Jesus. Thank you for the correction. 5:6.
For the Lord your God will bless you, just as he promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you.
So, interestingly enough, we have a World Bank, right? And we have an International Bank of Settlement. And they go through, that's what they do, is they lend to these nations. And quite a bit of it is nefarious. I mean, there's probably some good in there too, but a lot of them, are some of them maybe start off good, like public works kind of stuff, like putting electricity in, but then there's so many hands in it, and then they end up taking a lien against the valuable natural resources in that country, and they impoverish them, they get them in this debt cycle. So they do everything we just talked about with that 7-year thing, except they do it internationally. And they take these, there's actually a book about it, it's called Economic Hitmen, where they go in and they strong arm these countries, and they depend on the corrupt politicians, like we covered, I think, in the last chapter about taking bribes and that kind of stuff. And then they get these high loans that they know a small nation in Africa can't pay the loan back, because the intent is to foreclose and get the resources. It has nothing to do with the loan itself, right? And that's where we're seeing even God warning here, is that we should be lending to other nations with a godly mindset, not borrowing. And what are we doing, right? We're borrowing heavily, right? Look at our national debt, everything else. And the World Bank, does this on a world level. So we're not the only ones. Debt. There's very few countries that are debt free. There's a few, but not many right now. Almost the whole world is in this
Israel's one
situation.
of them, right?
I don't know that. I don't know that.
It would surprise me if they're pretty productive.
I know there's some, I think, maybe in that Hungary, and there's Hungary, and at one point Germany was, but I think when they took on the EU, that went down the toilet. But there's a few. I think some of the Central American countries, there's a couple that are very libertarian, and there's been moved to stable currency in a couple of them, which has helped. The currencies themselves draw debt too. So if you're doing a central bank, it's almost always issued with debt. So
I have a question about, is the World Bank connected to the World Economic Forum?
I think so. I don't know the exact answer to that. There is, we'll get to this later, but there is, the International Bank of Settlement now is requiring 20% gold on their borrowings, because they know that fiat currencies are dying, right?
There are
So-
10 countries. Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Czech Republic, Estonia, Singapore, and Taiwan that are debt free.
Oh, there you go. It'll be interesting how they measure that.
I mean, I just saw this as it's not just borrower versus lender. It's you shall not borrow, they shall not reign over you. That's a big deal, right? The second you take on debt, You're a subject to someone else. Someone else is reigning over you.
In their Proverbs, what is it?
Yes,
You know what I'm trying to say, right? Free yourself from the snare,
Yeah.
or,
yes.
you know. But yes, absolutely. And we have that, you know, with these, like China owns a ton of our debt right now, right? So, and they supply a lot, so they're, you know, it's all tied, right? So,
Cody, when you were talking about living out in the country, the Chinese are in these tiny apartments and they get 2 weeks a year to be in nature. And they flood all the pathways in the forest because it's their only chance. So we don't want to be a slave to China.
Right.
yeah. And they're buying up our farmland.
That's
Well,
got to stop.
presently, they own 30% of our farmland.
Wow.
Yeah. There's a couple of states that are starting to outlaw that, make them forfeit the land. So, okay, let's do 7 and 8.
If there is among you a poor man of your brethren, if any other gates in your land which the Lord your God has given you, you shall not harden your heart nor shut your hand from your poor brother, but you shall open your hand wide to him, willingly lend him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs.
Okay.
I like the body parts here, right? Don't harden your heart, which think of Pharaoh, he did do that. But there's heart, don't close your hand, open your hand to him. And then it's going to say it later in the passage, open your hand to your brother. And it's like, a couple of things struck me. First of all, if you go back to the Shema, it says, love the Lord with all your heart. And then write these words shall be a frontlet between your eyes and bind them to your hands. And I think there's a connection here because your eyes, your heart desires, your eyes see, and your hands take. And there's that threefold, three-step pattern that either sin or doing the right thing causes. You desire something and then you see it, you desire it, and then you take it, and that can be good or bad. In Adam's case, it was bad. They saw the fruit, they desired it, and then they took it. But you've got these three things. It's like, no, my heart is hardened. I'm going to close my hand. I'm not going to help. And he's going to talk about your eyes here. And your eye, see that not your eye is malicious towards your poor brother. And so you've got these three things kind of happening here, which I think is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and we'll get into that more in verse 11 too, where we talk about the purpose of the poor. Somebody want to read 9 through 11?
Beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry out to the Lord against you, and it becomes sin among you. You shall surely give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works, in all to which you put your hand. For the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to your poor, and to your needy, and your...
So, what is it, right? We had, there should be no poor among you, but the poor will always be among you, so which is it, right? And like I said before, I think this is kind of like the sin thing, right? There should be the chronically poor if we were following the rules, but at the same time, the poor among you is serving a purpose. The purpose is what's God's intent. God's intent is our heart, right? And if we aren't giving to the poor, if we are, think of Matthew, right? The sheep from the goats, right? What was the separating thing? Lord, when did we give you a cup of cold water? Lord, when did we visit you in prison? Lord, when did we give you a meat? All those things, right? That is the spirit of what he's saying here. He's saying the poor among you are to keep your heart pure, for you to model like Jesus, for you to be able to serve. It's a privilege for us to be able to serve. And the minute you start closing your fist, you're closing your heart, right? It's your hands that are kind of connected here, and if you don't give to the poor, then it's going to make you more greedy. is gonna make you, and then God can't bless, you know, the old saying, I think it was, God doesn't bless cul-de-sacs, right? You don't wanna be a cul-de-sac, right? You wanna be a thoroughfare, like, the things he gives you need to flow through you, right? So that they can be a blessing to others. And the more you are a blessing to others, then the more God can bless you. If God blesses you and it all just, you're clenching here, then you're not being responsible with what God gave you, and he will limit how much he can give you, right? So the poor serve a function, they're a test for us, right? Of what are we gonna do, right? Are you going to model my heart? You're made in my image, right? That's what the Lord's saying.
When we go to Israel, we use the analogy of the two seas. So the northern lake is the Sea of Galilee, the southern is the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea because it's got this high mineral content. The Jordan River stops at the Dead Sea, there's no outlet. And so whereas the Sea of Galilee is fresh water, it's full of life because the Jordan can flow through it in one end and out the other. And we use that as the picture of, you know, how is your life? Are you giving out like the Sea of Galilee, giving life, giving nourishment, giving water to the land, or are you holding all the resources for yourself like the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is just like shrinking up inch by inch as the years go by? So it's that same thing. Don't be like the Dead Sea.
Okay. And then the question I had here for our discussion is, how in America do we take care of the poor?
Let the government do it,
Yeah.
and it's not biblical.
Right. And then what systems do we have? We have like welfare and that type of thing. What does that promote?
Dependency.
And slavery, right?
Yeah.
And you know,
And then finally entitlement.
Yeah.
right, and it also promotes the corrupt politicians because they use the welfare to get the votes, right? So it's a form of slavery for them, and then even the principles of it, you know, like if you're on welfare and you get married, you get your check cut, right? Because they don't want to hand up like you used this morning. They want to hand out, right? So the whole idea here is we should be a hand up when someone needs it, not a hand out. And we shouldn't do it for our heart. We should, and it should be locally. It should be based on the community, right? Constitutionally, there should be no national health, welfare or any of that. All of that was supposed to be at the state level and lower. And the principle that we were founded on is the lowest level is the best level, right? And a lot of these roles, like Mary Beth said, you know, should be the church's responsibility anyway, right? Like the hospitals you talked about this morning, right?
Yeah, even the non-profit hospitals with the cross on the building they're taking government money, they're beholden to government regulators, like you.
Yeah.
I defend things.
Yeah.
No, but it's still they're and they do some charity, don't misunderstand, but it's not the holistic where the community is taking care of each other like I think what God's outlining here.
Exactly. Okay. 12 through 15. Who'd like to read?
If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, was sold to you and served for 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. When you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress. And what the Lord has blessed you with, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this thing today.
So give him a severance package. Help him not to be in the situation again where he has to enslave himself or her, she herself. If you have a millstone, give him a millstone so he can grind his own meal. If you have excess wine press, and that's a whole process that it is to have the grapes. So give that. Give him extra of your flock. You know, send him away so that he or she can be self-sufficient. This is 1 John. Whoever has worldly goods and sees his brother or sister in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God remain in him?
What's that verse again?
Where did we do it? 1 John 3:17. And it all comes back to being doers.
Right.
If you love me, you'll keep my commands.
I think there's a verse in James
Yeah.
too, where it says something effective. You come across, I'm paraphrasing, but you come across someone that's hungry and cold,
Yeah.
and you tell them, "Be warm and be filled." Going your way, right? Instead of taking them, then you're not doing the heart of God, right? Because you need to literally feed them, right? That's the heart.
And as we get into the next part, remember that in the New Testament language, debt and sin were the same word. So every sin we make, we're charging it, right? Charging it to God's account, and either we accept the payment that was made for it, or we don't, but it's still a debt. And so every sin we make, we add to His suffering on the cross. And so the next passage talks about this bond slave, where we become, no, I want to stay under this house.
Yeah. So someone want to read 16 through 18?
And if it happens that he says to you, I will not go away from you because he loves you and your house, since he prospers with you, then you shall take him home and thrust it through his ear to the door. And he shall be your servant forever. Also to your female servant you shall do likewise. You shall not send hard to you to send him away free from you. For he has been worth a double hired servant and served you 6 years. And the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do.
So this is a picture of what Paul told in Paul's letters. He says, "I'm a bond servant of Christ," right? So what would happen is on the year of Jubilee, if you were in a good house and you enjoyed that house and you wanted to remain in that house because they were taking care of you and you were blessed, you're kind of like Joseph in Potiphar's house, right? Everything's abundant and you're working there and you've got good work and you've got great conditions and you love everything, then you could choose out of free will, instead of going for free and getting the provisions, your severance package, as Chris said, then you could choose to remain as a voluntary slave, a bondservant, not, it was a different level,
Yeah.
right? So it was a voluntary slave, and then they would pierce your ear through this process here, and that would mark you as you were volunteering to be of that household. And it was a whole different level, right? And that's what Paul is saying that he is. Like, we, as Christians, we want to be in the household of God, right? We want to take on His burden, His yoke, because His yoke is light, right? So we want to be a bondservant for Christ and be marked as having His yoke, because we know if we go on our own, we're going to end up picking up another yoke, and that's the yoke of the world or the enemy or fill in the blank, and a yoke that we don't want to carry. So the only yoke we need is to be a bondservant of Christ, right?
Staying in the household of the one who paid your debt.
Right. Exactly. Because the debt was paid, and we choose to stay there and abide with Him. For a day in the presence of the Lord is like 1,000, better than 1,000 days. 19 through 21.
All the firstborn males that come from your herd and your flock, you shall sanctify to the Lord your God. You shall do no work with the firstborn of your herd, nor shear the firstborn of your flock. You and your household shall eat it before the Lord your God, year by year, in the place which the Lord chooses. But if there is a defect in it, if it is lame or blind, or has any serious defect, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God.
Okay, a couple of things. We're going to get into some of the celebrations and all that next week. I've already gotten ahead to chapter 16. But understand that God wants community. He wants fellowship. God is 3 in 1, right? So He's of community. He wants us to have community. So even, I think it's important here to say that, the firstborn, you shall eat it before the Lord in a place He chooses. So it's not that you're giving it and not going to share in the
Yeah.
abundance. He just wants you to share with those people. He wants us to be able to bring it, and be able to share it with those less fortunate, and to honor the Lord and share in it. To not just give them a MRE or something and send them on their way, but to have them sit at the table with you and enjoy it, right? That's His heart out of here. And then there's this whole thing of giving the Lord your best. We had a discussion about that this morning. What is giving of the first fruits? What is giving of the best to you today? Like, how do we live that out? How do we give not only monetarily, but out of our service, out of our heart, out of our gardens, out of our chickens, out of whatever it is that we have? Are we giving the best? If you have a trade, if you're a mechanic, you donate some of your time to fix somebody's car in need. Do you whatever it is that you do, are you tithing out of that for God's benefit and not just money? Any thoughts? I mean, I kind of shared that, like, this year I tithed out of my garden. Honestly, I never had enough to tithe before. But between the prayer and
Your $50 tomatoes.
yeah, my $50 tomatoes finally went down to a reasonable amount, so I've been able to share, and my wife's got a passion right now for making bread. I think it's her therapy, so she's been sharing sourdough with friends and neighbors and, all that kind of stuff. And, what's your heart? Whatever it is that you're doing of your hands, are you sharing in that effort? Whatever it is. It could be mums, and you provide a mum to some girl that can't afford it, right?
Casey and I actually talked about last year, we didn't find any local girls, but I'm gonna see if I can go further and find somebody in foster care, maybe a senior in foster care that their family does not have the money for a month, and senior year is so special, if I can find just one.
Yeah.
I've actually been thinking about doing that, trying again this year, but
Yeah,
I didn't find one last year, but.
We'll pray about it. God will open the door. But that's what we need to do, right? We need to have our hands open, right? Like, for instance, I think I've said this before, but I have a membership to the Bible Museum in D.C. So, praise God, every time I go, I've been able to take a coworker that has never been to the Bible Museum. And I bought the membership so that I have an extra one. And every time I've gone, I've brought a new coworker. And like this year, I didn't think I was going to have anybody. And then at the last minute, someone called and said, yeah, I'm free. And God, delivered again, right? So then I get 5 hours explaining the Bible to somebody that doesn't know it and sharing a meal downtown in D.C. And it's just a magical experience, right? So, okay.
It was almost in Dallas, that museum too.
What?
That museum was almost in Dallas.
Yeah.
Got one in DC.
Okay, 22 and 23.
You may eat within your gates, the unclean and clean person alike may eat it, as if it were a gazelle or deer. Only you shall not eat his blood, you shall pour it on the ground like water.
So understand that the context of this was the animal that has a defect, lame, blind, serious defect. So he's not saying that it can't be eaten. He's saying that you need to share it, right? And within your gates, right? So provide for your community first, right? This is kind of the Nehemiah concept, right? If you want the whole wall built, you work on the wall in your backyard first, right? And then if everybody handles their backyard, the whole wall gets done in record time, right? But spiritually speaking, someone has to be watching and gardening. You may have to have a trowel in one hand and a spear in another. And somebody's got to be the watchman on the wall, blow the whistle or a horn when trouble arises, right? And that's us, right? Anything else there, Chris, before I read the last one?
No, good.
So I put in here just because I kind of thought about it. And there's a biblical illustrator which will go a little deeper, but if someone could read Leviticus on page 4, that one section, 35, 19, 35, and 36.
You shall do no injustice in judgment, in measurement of length, weight, or volume. You shall have honest scales, honest weights, and honest ephah, and an honest hin. I, the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt.
So God's currency has always been gold and silver, and we have a fiat currency that we use. So the question is our currency honest measures and weights? Right? That's the first question. And if you believe it's not honest measures and weights, then think about what God thinks of our currency and not what you think of it. And do you want God's will or your will, right? So what I'm trying to say is think about things, because I don't want to see our dollar collapse, right? It would be devastating to us. But at the same time, God can't have unjust weights and measures. So maybe God's will on our currency in the long run may be a good thing, right? So that your kids don't have to endure what we've had to endure, right? The purchasing power of the dollar is, dropped, 99, I mean, think about it. Gold was, when we got off the gold-based currency, it was $35 an ounce. It's $2,500 an ounce today. So just do the math on how much your dollar has fallen. Like if you would have bought a house back then, I think it was, I've seen the math on it, but it was something to the effect of, it works out to about $400,000 in gold versus the price of the currency today, it'd be $5,000 or something. It's amazing, right? So like that same amount of dollars that would have bought a house in 1972, if you'd have not bought the house and you'd have bought gold, you could buy a house today. Because the gold hasn't changed value, right? But we've had dishonest measurements, right? So every currency that has not been based on hard value, that hasn't had honest weights and measures, has failed all throughout society. Going all the way back to the Romans when they would shade the coins and then, take the silver out and put, lesser metals in and everything else. And we in America seem to think that that won't happen to us, right? And, that's something that you want to pray about. Like I mentioned before, the Bank of International Settlement is now going 20% to gold. And there is a movement to gold back the dollar again today. And maybe we can pray into that, because if we do back it with gold, then even though the value will be much different, at least it would stabilize it, Go
Our
ahead.
Senator Hughes proposed in last legislative session to create a gold-backed digital currency for the state of Texas. It didn't go anywhere, but
Yeah, there's apparently the artwork is already in for gold backs. I can bring some, y'all remind me next class if you're interested, but I have a few gold backs. But they actually have the technology to print a bill, and it has one, you buy it in like micro ounces or whatever it is, but it's literally 24 karat gold plated. It's a beautiful bill, but they actually have gold backs, and they're in several states. They're in Wyoming and Utah and I forget, 4 or 5 different states. Texas, the artwork is in for our state to do gold backs. Go ahead.
I was thinking about a different kind of currency with Chris's statement about every time we sin, we make Christ suffer more on the cross. So the currency, God's currency isn't just gold, it's suffering.
That's a deep thought. Okay. Anybody got anything else?